crime, education, health, environment, and of course the big topic at the moment is Brexit. All of these issues will be put to them with questions from you, the panel. Those questions have been suggested not just by the young people here, but by young people from universities around the country. During the course of this evening, we have a panel of fact checkers who will be checking what is being said by the candidates and what has been said in party manifestos during this election campaign. We will be speaking to them along the way. And of course, we have our panel and debate to be led this evening by Nicole Badley and Connor Stringer.
So the format for this evening is quite simple. We have four themes previously chosen by a group of students to frame the debate this evening. Those themes are health, the environment, crime and education.
But before that, as is custom in these debates, we'll throw to the panel to introduce themselves in 45 seconds. Duncan.
So we'll start this end, Corey Drew.
I'm Cora Drew. I'm a local resident. I've lived and worked in about 20 years now. And I'm running as the Labour candidate for Bournemouth because I love our town and I want the best for everyone here. I really believe that Labour's policies give the best for our town, whether that's on healthcare, education, the environment, policing, business or housing. And I think it's really important that we work together on that. I believe our diversity is our strength, and I'd love to represent everybody in Bournemouth and work with them and for them in Parliament.
And we'll move along the panel. So Ben Aston, independent candidate. Tell us about yourself.
So I'm Ben. I'm standing as independent candidate in Bournemouth East against Corey, I suppose. And so I ran the Brexit Party campaign in Bournemouth East until a few weeks ago, and then Nigel Farage told us to stand down. So I stood up. And the reason I'm standing is because I don't think that Boris's deal is Brexit. I think it's a subversion of Brexit, and I think that it will deliver a failed Brexit and an eventual integration into the EU, which I don't want to happen. But the other elements of my platform are housing. I think housing is the most important issue in the UK at the moment, other than Brexit, and social behaviour, which is a serious problem in Bournemouth East. And bringing jobs and new wealth to the area.
Moving along now, Dave, also an independent candidate. Tell us about yourself.
Yes, so I'm David Young. I'm a Wimborne farming family. I brought up my children over the last 20 years. And I have been following the whole Brexit saga for years. I was very excited when I joined the common market. I remember that. I was 17. I went to Germany to learn the language and work there. I'm very much in favour of cooperation, trade, and so forth. But I became progressively disillusioned as a businessman working with small businesses about the impact on small businesses of the EU. We waited a long time for the referendum. Finally we got it, and the result, as you know, was to leave. So I am very frustrated on behalf of the majority of the population voted to leave because it hasn't been delivered by a Conservative government, which I believe was serious about delivering it, let alone the rest of the parliamentarians. To that extent, I share Ben's perspective. I was the Brexit candidate for Paul till I too stood down, and I decided to run to give people in Poole the opportunity to vote against the Tory mismanagement of Brexit and many other things.
David, thank you. Vicky Slade, Liberal Democrats.
Yes, hi, I'm Vicky Slade. I'm the Mid Dorset and North Liberal Democrat candidate. I am currently the leader of Bournemouth Council since 2011. I've lived here since 1999 with a background in finance, charity sector, and I've had my own business. So I've got a really broad background in different areas to understand about why the moderate centre needs representation and sure that we deliver the very best we can in public services whilst encouraging to make the best of themselves and ensuring we've got a safe net for all of us. So I'm absolutely passionate about that position in the market and very keen to try and overturn the Conservative in our area.
Thank you. Simon Ball, the Green Party.
Hello. I'm Simon Ball. I'm the Bournemouth West candidate for the Green Party. I've been councillor since 2015. Bournemouth in 1999. I've got a background in finance and in charities. Last 20 years working in the sector. I'm I think I'm stunned the environment mentioned by any other candidates because that is the most important issue of our day. It is the biggest challenge we face is to keep our planet somewhere where we can live and thrive and have our children and have their lives. So I'm quite stunned that hasn't come up. There are many issues that we're going to get into tonight. I'm a Remainer. I think we're better in Europe, working with them than out. Working from the outside, we will get nowhere. We stand nothing leaving Europe. So I very firmly believe we should stay within Europe.
Thank you very much. There will be plenty of time during the discussion this evening to talk about the environment. It is one of our topics. We have questions from the audience on that subject. And we will start, though, with the subject of health with a question from Hussein Malik. Hussein, have we got a microphone? There we are. So all the questions, as we say, have been suggested by students from around the country. Well, we might just get to you. Right, Hussein, what's your question? Shout it out loud. Thank you.
With the population living longer, younger people face paying more and more tax to support the NHS. Do you really think the current NHS business model is sustainable, or is a greater degree of privatization inevitable?
Question, and we'll start with Corey Drew. Corey, Labour will give the NHS the most cash, but do you have a staffing solution?
Obviously, we've lost a lot of staff over recent years for many reasons, not only due to cuts, but actually due to staff going off with stress, looking for careers in other areas, and the general pressure that we've put on our NHS staff across the board has been huge. I've met a lot of people in our town on the doorstep in the last couple of years who have told me how hard it's been for them and that they've ended up wanting to look to other careers. We obviously need to work across a number of levels to be able to restore confidence in the sector so that people will return to it, so that people will go into training in healthcare professions as well. Some of what we can do there starts on the education side of things, so Labour wants to make sure that we enable people of all ages to be able to take qualifications in healthcare roles. We will do that by returning the nursing bursary and also by cancelling tuition fees, making it more accessible for people. But as well as that, we need to make sure that there's a better working environment so that people are wanting to stay, so that we get the best healthcare professionals and we keep them, and so that they can focus on actually delivering and doing their job. Because we've heard stories, I know on the news even today, from doctors and nurses who are distraught because they feel the pressure and the anxiety of knowing that they are not able to save lives and not able to give that treatment. I believe that prevention in all things is better than a cure, and not only is it better for the patient, but it's also better on us economically. And if we can get a very organised, well-running healthcare system with happy, well-funded staff and resources, we can make sure that we're looking more at prevention and therefore saving people's lives and getting them back at work and saving money in the NHS as well.
Corey,
so
I'm aware of time,
all of
so
those areas.
we could wrap it up. Thanks. Vicky Slade. Vicky, the NHS has been at the forefront of your campaign. Anything to say in response?
Yeah, I mean, we've been saying it from the 2017 election, and now that it isn't just about the sort of general pot, we need to actually pay more if we're going to get a better service. So we would ask everybody to pay 1p in the pound more at each level of income tax, so that we are actually able to support the NHS better. But for us, it's more about actually bringing together NHS and social care, because you have this ridiculous situation where the hospitals are desperately trying to look after somebody, get them well, they get sent out into the community, the council can't afford to maintain them because that's funded by the local taxpayer, the local council are then trying to get them back into hospital so that the funding's there. Actually need to bring the two together. Health and social care need to be one, and that's where our money would go to health, social care and mental health. We would also bring back the nursing bursary, and I think it's really important that we do look after our people who want to go into that world. And speaking as someone whose daughter's currently in hospital, the empathy and the care that so many nurses came into it with is gone because they're so stressed. And we really have got to try looking after people in whatever their work is, so that they can go in and enjoy the job that they loved and that they've helped to fund that career. So I'm very keen to do that.
Thank you, Vicky. David, would you bring back the nursing bursary?
Well, that's a very specific question. I was focused on the question, which I think hasn't really been addressed. The underlying point, I think, is very valid, which is that we have an aging population. The costs of medical care rise exponentially with increasing age, and we also have the rise of medical science. So we can expect the costs of healthcare to explode, and we do have an unmanageable situation if you look over any reasonable time frame. And so we do need to have a national debate about how we're going to cope with this, I think. And it does seem to me that insurance models can be effective because they provide a linkage between preventive medicine and healthier lifestyles and treatment. As I said, I worked in Germany. I spent some time in Germany. There they have a sort of system rather like our car insurance model, where you have compulsory insurance, but you can go to a private insurance provider. Those private insurance providers are incentivized to push people, as people like Bupa do here, to healthier lifestyles, to medical checkups, to earlier diagnosis, and so on. So we need systems to try and help us join the dots and get the population living in a healthier way.
Simon, the NHS and its future, what's your stance?
I'm not sure that privatisation is going to help reduce costs. Obviously, privatisation means an element of profit making for the companies. So how that will reduce costs, I can't quite see it. The NHS is one of the jewels of the country. It's a fantastic service. I slightly disagree here with Vicky about the empathy and the energy of the nursing staff. I was in hospital earlier this year, and they were still fantastic. Despite everything, they still had empathy and care for all their patients, which I think is tremendous, and we need to look after them. They are a very important asset that we have. As I say, privatisation will cost us more in the long run. If you look at what the American hospital charges cost, it is a fortune. And that's fine if you can afford it. If you can afford the insurance, that's fine. If you can't, tough luck. And I don't think that's a system we want in the UK.
Thank you, Simon. Ben Aston, Hussein's question, do you think the current NHS business model is sustainable?
I don't know, it depends on the future of the country, right? I mean, the NHS is a question of economics, really. The UK economy, I mean, let's start with the numbers, right? So the UK economy is 2 trillion. We expend about 8% of GDP on the NHS and health in general, which is just under £200 billion a year. So it's a huge expenditure, and that expenditure's gone up, and it's gone up with things like population increase, increasing life expectancy, but also, most importantly, the increasing period of unhealthy living that people tend to have at the end of their life. So whilst life expectancy's gone up, the corresponding duration of healthy life has not gone up at the same rate. So what we've ended up with is a greater cohort of unhealthy people towards the end of their lives that are, obviously exerting a cost on the NHS. So I think that kind of points to something that maybe we should do, but I don't think privatisation is inevitable.
Thank you, Ben. I'm keen to bring in another question, so back to Duncan.
Yeah, with the next question in our audience, Emily Barker. Where's Emily hiding? So we can get Emily, I'll write it there, handy by the microphone, just up there. What's your question, Emily, for the panel?
So my question, the number of children seeking help from child and adolescent services has doubled in 2 years. So why do you think mental health problems are still so prevalent within young people?
Thank you, Emily. Simon, let's start with you. Why are mental health problems, or why do you think mental health problems are so prominent amongst young people?
I think there's all sorts of reasons why mental health occurs and what causes it. I think there's something fundamentally wrong with our society at the moment that's causing conflict and unnecessary stress amongst all of us, and the young people are bound to pick that up. Our mental health services have been underfunded for quite some time, and it's definitely an area where we need to have input to. Our society is very divided at the moment in the UK, and I think we need to take steps to change that. We need to change the political system, change the economic system, and start taking care of each other, and stop worrying quite so much about GDP and more about people.
Corey, Drew, young people and mental health problems.
first moved to the area, I actually worked as a youth worker across the conurbation for quite a few years with a variety of different young people, and I think that it was really interesting to see the difference in services that were available then to those that are available now. I felt that things were quite good 20 years ago. We had quite a lot going on in the area, but there was more that needed to be done, and yet now here we find ourselves where we've lost in the last couple of years of austerity, we've lost about 63% of our youth services funding in the area. And obviously we needed more, not less. And I think we have a number of factors that seem to be at play when you speak to young people. And actually we're losing hope, I think, across the board. I agree with some of what Simon said. I think we're losing a hope for people's future, and I think that we are, as well as letting down people with actual support for mental health difficulties and giving people long waiting times and not giving them the care that they need, we also aren't offering people anything for the future. We're not building people up. We're not taking care of the opportunities that people need in their lives to be able to have that vision that things for them will improve and that they've got something there to look forward to. And I really want to see a government that actually puts that back on the table so that people know that actually the care is there when they need it, and that then they're going to be able to have a happy life, they're going to be able to be part of society, they're going to be able to achieve their dreams. And right now I don't see that for young people in our area. We have terrible opportunities with work and with housing, and we need to really rebuild those things as well as the mental health provision to make sure that we're looking at the whole person.
Thank you, Corey. I'll speedily move this along. Ben, back to Emily's question. Do you think mental health problems, or why do you think mental health problems are so poignant amongst young people?
Prevalent amongst young people?
Prevalent, yeah.
Well, that's a huge question. I mean, I'm not sure that anyone really knows. It's multifactorial. I mean, look, society has changed phenomenally over the past 15 years. I mean, I guess you can probably point at the invention of the smartphone for some kind of inflection point. But, the whole world changed as soon as the iPhone was invented. But I think I'd like to focus on one thing, and that's housing. I think the ability to afford a roof over your head.
I'm keen to keep this on mental health at the moment. We'll get on to housing, but mental health. Why do you think it's so prevalent amongst young people?
I mean, look,
we can come back to you, David.
No. So it's okay. I mean, I think I'm just reluctant to move away from housing because I think it's so core to your mental health to have the ability to afford a house and then start a family, and also job opportunities. I think the way that capitalism has evolved in the UK is towards kind of 0 hours contract work, and I think that it's very difficult when you're living in an uncertain financial environment, a precarious financial environment where you could be fired on the spot, and there's no kind of investment in your future professional development. Combine that with it's increasingly difficult to get on the housing ladder. I think it's quite obvious that this is going to have a stressful effect on normal young human beings who are just emerging from school.
Thank you, Ben. David, we'll move this along.
Yeah, I think we've surfaced the fact that there are a lot of stresses in modern society, from housing to I would say family breakup. I've been through a painful divorce, and it's had a very bad effect on all of us, including my children. I think that in an environment where both parents are having to work to make ends meet, it's hard for kids to have a sense of belonging. Often kids are left at home without anyone to care for them. I was struck, having gone to a police meeting in the Ashley Road and hearing about delinquency there, to then be out and about canvassing and talk to one or two individuals who actually reflected the same problem and then turned out knew the names of the kids. Were quite affectionate about the kids and knew the parents and would call the parents who were down at the pub if the kids were misbehaving, and the parents didn't want to know. So, it comes back to simple things like providing facilities for the kid, encouraging parenting. We have RSE in school from the age of 4. Why don't we have any classes about what the needs of a young human being are as they grow up in society? And I think they include parenting and belonging and having social facilities and health clubs and so on.
Thank you, David. Vicky, is parenting the reason why this has doubled in the last years. Is parenting the reason? Could you explain?
No, it's not. I mean, you know, there have always been parents that aren't great at looking after kids, but, you know, the huge increase in people trying to access CAMS, child and adolescent mental health services, is across the board, and I think there's three main issues. One's social media, one's society, and the other one's school. You know, everyone is being put under huge amounts of pressure to perform 24 hours a day. They're expected. My little girl has got a phone at the side of her bed and got 156 messages sent to her by another young child at 11 o'clock at night, you know, giving her the most awful visual messages. That screws with young children's heads. They're not capable of coping with that sort of thing. But you come to school and, you know, they're having to be tested and tested and tested and tested. They've got no hope for the future. It's the first generation where we're not expecting them to have a better life than their parents. You know, that they're worried about the environment. You know, kids are worrying. They're growing up too soon, and we need to let them carry on being children for a little bit longer. I did an assessment when I was on Poole Council. 35 families I approached, and they couldn't get access to mental health services unless their child had tried really, really hard to kill themselves.
Thank you, Vicky. We're keen to move this along. Duncan, to the next theme and the next question.
Yeah, moving on to the subject of environment. We'd love to debate more on many of these issues. Environment, Jose Ramos has the next question for us. Jose, your question, please.
Young people are living in a world facing environmental disaster. Do you support young people taking the matter into their own hands, walking out of schools and colleges to lead the protest against the lack of perceived action over climate change?
To go straight to Simon Bull from the Green Party for this question. Do you support the student climate strikes?
I do. I think it's very important. This is the future for young people. I think schools could be more accommodating and more aware of the situation. The argument that they need to be in school to get education, well, they need to have a planet to make that worthwhile being educated for. So I think it's very important that they do have their education, but it's also very important that they take the opportunity to stand up for the planet. The environment is so crucial to all our futures. What will we do if we don't have a planet to live on? You know, it's a crazy system. It should be the most important topic. It should be what we're all talking about. I heard today on the radio that the ice caps are melting far quicker than the IPCC expected. So what does that mean? They said we had 10 years to change all our plans. Has that gone down? Are we changing quick enough? I know BCP Council are working hard on their climate and ecological emergency motion and the actions they're going to be taking. But is it enough, and is it soon enough? We really need to get on with this. So if children and young people feel that strongly that they want to take a time off school on a Friday afternoon, I think yes, go for it.
Great, thank you. And to Vicky, so you are the leader of BCP, and you have announced a climate emergency. So as Lib Dem candidate in this area, what is your stance on supporting the children that have gone out for the climate strike?
Most of us have actually been out and joined the kids on the strike. I've been up at the one in London. I couldn't come to one locally because I was in London, so I joined the one up there. And I think, you know, we've got to get behind young people. They have such incredible ability to influence their parents and their grandparents and to drive us all forward. You know, of course, you know, they need to be in school, but actually this is the biggest issue in our world, and I think if they feel this strongly about it, then we should support them and we should listen to them. Greta Thunberg is such an incredible inspiration, not just to young people, but to adults as well. We haven't done enough, and we need to be taking this on the chin and letting the children lead us.
Great. So I'm going to throw this over to Ben. So the biggest emergency of our generation. Could you tell us what you would plan to do to support the children going out on the climate strike?
Okay. Well, you know, look, the question really is should we support students in getting involved in political activism? And the answer to that is obviously yes. But then there's nuances to that question, and the question, you know, should we support students walking out of school and taking time out of school? if it's within the framework of the curriculum, then I don't see a problem with that. But if children are somehow kind of walking out of school when they could have taken part in a protest on a Saturday, I don't see a fundamental difference between an environmental protest on a Friday or an environmental protest on a Saturday. So, you know, I don't. So I would say there are nuances to the discussion, but definitely we should support getting involved in political activism because there isn't enough of it. In terms of what I would do with respect to what.
So what would you do in your policies to show the children that you support what they're doing, and how would you move this on?
Well, I think you know, environmentalism is a huge issue, and I think the two biggest things are obviously carbon and plastic. And so, in terms of plastic, I would legislate to force companies to reduce the amount of plastic waste that they create, because every time you go into Tesco's, you're surrounded by a wall of plastic. I think it's completely unnecessary. And so, I mean, the first thing I would do is try and use voluntarism so that companies voluntarily act to reduce the amount of plastic they create. But if they don't act, then I would legislate. And on carbon, you know, there seems to be a race towards zero carbon for the UK. I think we should also focus on the other economies that create the majority of the carbon that actually are creating products that we use, like China and India.
Great, thank you. So, David, how do you respond to the students walking out of class for the climate strike?
I think it's a matter of balance. It's great for young people to be encouraged to be politically active, but I think I would echo some of Ben's points about getting the balance right and finding the right context for it. I also worry about youngsters perhaps who get panicked by a sense of impending doom that we tend to get from the Green Party. I mean, we have had these. Well, we've had these.
We've got less than 10 years to change ways.
Well, I'm willing to bet that in 10 years' time we'll be able to meet here and have a drink, and we'll be saying it's 10 years further out. I mean, we've had these things. I'm not denying there's a serious issue here. I'm just saying we've had these critical alarmist predictions for years, and they haven't come true.
I think Simon
we need to take action, but it needs to be held within balance.
It is within balance. It's taking action now. We have declared an emergency. There is an emergency. When there is an emergency, when the house is on fire, you try and put it out. You don't keep fanning the flames and look at other things.
May I ask how Poole declaring a climate emergency is going to rein in carbon emissions in China and India?
It's not, but we're going to help to lead the way. We need to get our own house.
It's up to every single one of us to take responsibility and to make serious changes to our lives so that we are not. I mean, we've had 200 years of an industrial revolution in this country. We've led on this, and we've actually encouraged everybody else to do it, and now we're expecting them to change without us
doing change. Do you think we can solve it unilaterally? Can we solve it unilaterally?
Okay, so I'm just going to move the debate on actually to Corey, who's agreeing with you there about the house is on fire. So could you tell us how you would support the children?
Well, that was quite shocking, David. In terms of the children and young people walking out of their schools on Fridays, I've been with them at almost every one of the local youth strike for climate, and I've been really, really proud to support them. I've taken time off of work to do that because I think it's really important, and it has to be time off of school because it has to be a strike, it has to be a protest to have impact, because ultimately if we don't have a planet then there is no point in the rest of their education. And I really hope, Ben mentioned about the curriculum, I really hope that our school curriculums catch up with what the young leaders are actually telling us we need to be doing, because they should be setting the curriculum to fit around this very, very important issue. And I think we need to listen to the children and young people, not patronise them and not deny the severity of the problem. I've been campaigning on the climate since I was 6, and we spoke a little bit, a few people have mentioned about social media and about smartphones. There wasn't any internet when I was 6, and there was no way for me to connect with other children and young people who were desperately worried about the environment. And I would love to have been part of the Youth Strike for Climate when I was a little one. And I'm so, so pleased to see so many young leaders actually taking control of the situation, because I got told when I was little it's all right, the grown-ups are going to take care of it, and 30 years later the grown-ups have not taken care of it. We are plummeting down.
I'm going to stop you there, just on that subject, because our next question is about what the grown-ups can be doing or actions that can be taken about the environment. So our next question from Fazia Mustafa. Oh, there we are. Your question, please.
You're all very quick to advocate a cleaner world, but what are you doing For example, how many of you have considered swapping your cars for bicycles?
Thank you. So, David, I'm going to go straight to you on this one. What have you personally done?
Well, I'm not denying the severity of the problem, but I think that if you cry wolf many times, then you're going to get a blasé reaction from people. And it's actually counterproductive to be
but
too
an
alarming.
Answer to the question.
So what I do is I walk where I can. I use my car as little as I can. I find that I can walk around town. I mean, we're pretty well served in our area. You know, in London it's different, but there's public transport, and I use my car as little as possible.
Okay. Any other things that you actively do to try and help the environment in your day-to-day life?
Well, what I'm excited about and what I've been talking about is geothermal energy, which is, I think, the most promising green source of energy that we've got. There is British technology for very deep drilling, which can sink single wells to a depth of 10 kilometres.
Okay,
it's been patented now, and without fracking, we'll be able to extract energy. This is green, and we won't require the vagaries of wind. We won't require disposable wind turbine or non-disposable wind turbine.
Unfortunately, you can't do that single-handedly by yourself, which was what the question was. So, Vicky,
you asked me what I was doing. I'm promulgating
can I ask
a solution.
You how you actively contribute to a cleaner world?
Yeah, of course. Obviously, in my role as a councillor, we've done loads and loads that we've actually brought in this climate emergency, which Simon and I both campaigned on in the local elections, and Simon led on it, and we've supported it. So in my working life, I'm doing that on a daily basis, trying to reduce the amount. One of the really important things we're doing is trying to reduce the amount of paper that we're using, trying to put a lot more of our meetings so that we're not actually having to have paper using our laptops. Desperately trying to reduce the amount of plastic in our lives. We've started keeping bees. We have solar panels on our house. I've actively supported Navitas Bay Wind Farm and supporting the new community energy company that are trying to come up with new ways of doing that locally. I run an environmental recycling group in my community. All of my children cycle to school, and wherever I can in the local area, I'm using the barrel bikes to try to get around from one meeting to another. And we all need to do more. You know, whatever it is we were doing last week, we need to do more next week. I would love to change my car for an electric car. They are incredibly expensive, and that's something that I would hope to do in the next couple of years.
Thank you. Simon, you said the Navitas Bay Wind Farm would be a wonderful asset to our coastline. Can you also answer the question, what do you personally do to support?
Well, some of the things I've done is I put forward the motion to declare the climate and ecological emergency to the BCP Council when I became a councillor this time round. I'm very pleased to say that was passed almost unanimously. I think there was one against, which was a shame. Other things I've done, I've gone down from 2 cars to 1 car. I do have a bike, which I try and get out on, but I'm not very good, I must admit. That's an aspiration. I've certainly cut down on my meat. I eat a lot more vegan and vegetarian meals. I'm not fully vegan or vegetarian, but I am getting that way. I certainly don't eat beef because I think that's one of the worst things we can be doing at this point. I also supported Navitas. And I'm looking forward and hoping that somebody comes forward with Navitas too, and that we can get that through, because that's the sort of thing we desperately need. I certainly opposed the oil rig in Swanage and was down there campaigning, and the oil rig that was off the Bournemouth coast. That was an absolute eyesore that our local MP did very little to oppose, which was shocking, really. We don't need to be getting fossil fuels out the ground. And I also take the train where I can instead of driving.
Great, thank you.
And I'm still working on it.
And Corey, can you echo those sentiments of sort of working on it, or what do you actively do for a cleaner environment?
It's always been a really big issue for me, making sure that just day-to-day decisions are all based on what's best for the environment. So where we buy things as well is really important. I like to look into companies and try and make sure that I spend my money in a wise way and support businesses that are looking at their carbon footprint, that where the distance isn't as large. So I buy food that's more local where I can. I make sure I reduce packaging packaging, all those sorts of things. Also things to do with clothing and the other products we buy. Everything, there is an array of options. So I always do my research and I look at what's the best option. I'm wearing vegan boots at the moment. I've been vegan for quite a while now. Before that I was vegetarian. The worst thing that we do for the planet is actually the meat and dairy industry. So that is the most important thing that I can do. That was quite an easy sacrifice for me to make. I've got several bicycles. Most of my life in the area I haven't had a car. I do at the moment for hauling book boxes around for the campaign, but once that's over I'll stop using that again.
Great.
And I've also taken the choice to not have children because I know that that also will help to reduce my long-term carbon footprint, which is obviously a really significant life choice, but it's something else that I can do.
Thank you. And Ben, just to follow up on what Corey was saying about making conscious decisions to shop locally and things like that, you earlier said that Tesco was like a wall of plastic. What do you do to actively try for a greener world?
Well, I don't own a car. I cycle everywhere, so that's a start. In terms of packaging, I mean, I think you can pick goods in the supermarket that aren't covered in multiple layers of packaging. So I find that if you eat, and I find actually it corresponds to a healthier diet. So if you eat kind of ready meals, then they're covered in multiple layers of plastic. Whereas if you kind of eat fruit and veg and a bit of meat every now and again, then I think you eat more healthily, but also reduce on the waste that you create. So I guess that's what I do. On the wind farm, I think that I would support cutting down on the use of fossil fuels because obviously they're horribly dirty things, although the modern world is built on fossil fuels. But I think the problem with the wind farm proposal was that it was within sight of the land, and of course, and I think that it would be a simple change. Just push it over the horizon. You can have the wind farm, but just because I don't see why they don't do that. So that's what I would do if I was having a wind farm. I'd make sure it was over the horizon.
Thank you. Before we move on from the environment debate, as you know, as we explained earlier on, we've got a panel of fact checkers here and supported by the organisation Full Fact. Abbas, you picked up a couple of things from the debate earlier that are worth mentioning. I'm just going to slip around this side. So what have you picked up?
Sure. So Corey Drew mentioned the fall in youth service funding in the area of 63%. Now, the way the statistics are collected on youth services, and I can only talk from a national perspective, there's the pot of money for the totality of kind of children's services, which have fallen by 13% between 2010-11 and 2019-20, and then the specific funding on youth services, which might not encapsulate everything you might consider to be a youth service, has fallen by a much greater degree, 73% nationally. So I was just wondering if you could give any more detail on the different pots of funding and what specifically has fallen by 63% in the local area against the kind of wider pot of money that goes into children and local children and young people services.
I believe the figure, I've got the paperwork at home, is the local Bournemouth version, so it was for East and West of the 70 odd percent that you just said. It was the local version of that. So
it doesn't incorporate the entirety of what you might consider to be a children and youth service.
No, it was youth service specifically.
So just for.
So not education, and not any healthcare relating, just actual youth services in the area. So we're talking about youth workers, youth centre provision, and all of the resources around that.
Because youth clubs actually aren't included in that services for young people pot that has seen the bigger reduction. So it might be the case that actually when it's all considered in its totality, there has been a fall, but it's not been as dramatic as it might seem.
Obviously depends on which numbers you're looking at, yeah.
Okay, thank you both very much. I know there are more questions that we could discuss on the issue of the environment, but I am going to move on. We might come back to things along the way. Excuse me while I skip out the way and get my clipboard. I'm going to move on now to crime and a question from Kelsey. Where's Kelsey? I've seen you here. There you are. No, where is she? Moved. Kelsey's over there. Down at the front. So, subject of crime. Again, issues all suggested by young people that are important issues to them. Kelsey.
So, as of September, there have been over 55 fatal stabbings in London alone, and crime is rife in our community. So, what would you do to make the streets safer for young people?
Thank you, Kelsey. Let's talk crime, folks, and let's start with you, David Young. You pledged to tackle the rising tide of antisocial behaviour. But how do you plan to make the streets safer?
Well, I think in London, I mean, there needs to be more policing, more use of stop and search, stricter bans on carrying knives. But then looking behind that, one's got to try and ascertain what is driving it. And as I understand it, it's to do with gangs and the way gangs draw people in and pit them against each other and challenge youngsters to commit these crimes. And so that needs to be tackled with better youth services and other activities for youngsters to get involved with, to try and stop them joining these gangs.
Stop and Search has been considered to be quite controversial in that it targeted particularly the black minority members of East London and North London society. So to increase that would further allow greater scrutinisation of that ethnic group, would it not?
Well, it shouldn't be targeted at any particular racial group. It should be done more widely. I think it needs to be done. I mean, but the problem with knife crime has become so acute that something needs to be done. So it's a question of balance.
Corey, Drew, I saw you sigh there. I think I heard you sigh. Knife crime, and what would you do, what would Labour do to make the streets safer across a national basis and also here local as well?
So I think, as with all things, there are a lot of different factors that come into what would cause somebody to actually commit a crime of any sort, let alone a knife crime. None of us aspire to that sort of lives when we're younger. And I think that I would bring it back in part to what I mentioned earlier about a lack of hope for young people. And I think obviously we need to make sure we're providing better opportunities across the board so that young people and adults don't ever actually have a need to feel that they need to turn to crime. I think there's a need for a lot more relationship-based community policing, like the kind of sort that we would see where you would have a Bobby on the beat who would know the area, and it was more about prevention and about building relationships in the community rather than the kind of aggressive approach that we've seen with some of the stop and search in the capitals. I've also seen some really good schemes that have been suggested in other areas. I've spoken with the local police and crime commissioner at great length about some of the things that have worked in the past in the area but have then been subsequently cut as part of the funding cuts, but things that could be brought back in that have been seen to work, and schemes where ex-offenders work with young people, and that could be quite good for prevention. And I think we need to bring back our community policing.
Thank you, Corey. Vicky Slade, is stop and search a solution to the rising tide of knife crime?
I'm not convinced that it is. I think I agree with Corey actually that it's about community policing. Our neighbourhoods have lost the police, and what you've then seen is that the low-level crime and antisocial behaviour rises. People think that they can get away with stuff. They know nobody's actually going to come and deal with the shoplifting and the sort of hanging around and the general sort of unease that then makes people feel really just not safe in their communities. I think knife crime we need to deal with as a public health issue. They did an incredible job in Glasgow when they moved across to a public health model. And I run a youth club, and youth clubs are an incredibly good way of spotting young people that are going off the rails early. You can direct them to mental health, you can raise them to social services, you can get involved with their parents and bring them in. For me, actually, it's about putting those wraparound services around young people. And the other issue, which is slightly off pace, is we need to be looking after those kids who are struggling at school, because if they're running below the radar and they're not achieving stuff at school, they're much more likely to see that alternative way of life, So we need to be looking after the kids that are failing to achieve what they need at school, because they're the ones that will need the mental health, the youth services, the social services, and those are the kids that we really need to put a blanket around.
Thank you, Vicky. Simon Bull, I'm keen to come to you. The Green Party, what would they do to make our streets safer?
I think it's quite a wide question. There's a lot of things we need to do. Policing, of course, is a big subject area. We need better policing, better finance policing. Community police, of course, play a big part in that. There is, as Corey said, a lack of hope today for many young people. We need to get them out of despair, get them back feeling that there is a future and they can be part of it. Funding for youth services is of course important, and it's the overall thing at school. We need to have the curriculum and the activities in school that help people to help their mental health, their physical health, their well-being. We need to put back music, we need to put back art, we need to put back sport into schools that's been missing from their curriculum these days.
Ben Ashton, is going towards the curriculum a solution to tackling the growing epidemic of knife crime?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, schools is the obvious point of intervention with young people before they kind of start kind of falling off the edge into antisocial behaviour. Knife crime, I guess, becomes more attractive the more disaffected you are with society. So anything you can do to undermine that disaffection and make young people feel that they're engaged and they've got a stake in society. There's also the other side of the coin, and that's that I think young people quite often carry knives for self-protection. So, you know, they don't intend to be the instigator of violence, but they intend to respond to it because they feel unsafe. So I think, you know, you need to look at both sides of the coin, and treating it as a public health issue, I think, is a sensible approach. You don't want to jump into criminality straight away, but certainly engaging with schools, that's a good place to start. But it is a serious issue, and it's symptomatic of a wider problem in society with lack of social cohesion and societal breakdown. And I think actually there's a much wider question there to be asked about what we can do to foster communities, particularly in inner city areas.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, Simon, please. Yeah.
Sorry. One thing that we haven't mentioned, of course, is drugs, and the fight against drugs. This war of drugs that we've been fighting for many years, and it's not working. The war against drugs, the cost in policing, the cost in the NHS, the cost to young people is astronomical. We need to have a different way of tackling drugs, a different way of looking at drugs. I think the Green Party policy on drugs and how we go forward with this may be controversial, and it is not ideal, but we cannot continue with this war on drugs because it is not working. It is giving organised crime the opportunity to make money out of young people, driving them into more crime, encouraging them to carry knives, encouraging them to attack each other. So we need to really tackle drugs, which is one of the main drivers in this.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Stop
Simon.
and Search was mentioned along the way. I was going to bring in our fact-checking team at this point. You've picked up on something earlier on, Abbas.
Sure. So I think the panel were talking about the effectiveness of stop and search on deterring future crime. The evidence that we've seen on it is that stop and search has essentially no deterrent impact. So a recent paper out of UCL found that looking at stop and search use in London over a 10-year period, that a 10% increase in stop and search in a given month would reduce non-domestic violent crime, so these are the sorts of kind of crimes that we're talking about here, by just 0.01%. So it's essentially a statistical error. There's like no correlation. Similarly, the Home Office's own analysis of something called Operation Blunt 2 during when the Met Police increased stop and search said overall analysis shows that there was no discernible crime reducing effects from a large surge in stop and search activity at the borough level during that operation.
David, so then thank you for the fact checkers in the corner. Stop and search not very successful, but you want to increase it. Surely there's an alternative if it's not that good?
Well, those are interesting statistics. I think you mentioned that was over the last 10 years, was it?
Yeah, the meta-analysis that found the 0.01% looked at a 10-year period of police statistics in London. The other analysis was specifically of something called Operation Blunt 2, which happened in the early part of this decade. I think it was brought in by the Met Police under Boris Johnson's tenure as mayor.
Yeah, I mean, we're now dealing with something approaching an epidemic, and you know, something needs to be done. Many things need to be done at many levels, and I agree there's a connection with drugs. It's counterintuitive to believe that stop and search can't have any effect in this situation. I think, you know, if you were related to people who'd been caught in this, you'd be feeling that stop and search was an important part of the arsenal. But I quite agree, the links with drugs need to be investigated, and we need to have a broader debate about whether the war on crime is working or whether we need to tackle it in other ways.
It's counterintuitive, certainly. I mean, those statistics, and that doesn't mean that they're wrong. So we should take an evidence-based approach to it. But I mean, it's difficult to interpret that result because you don't know what the knife crime would have been had Blunt 2 not been implemented. So you're saying that there was a decrease of a tiny percentage over and above the prior period, whatever that was, after Blunt 2 was implemented. But if you're sitting within the context of an escalating problem, then that could actually be a decrease. So it's you have to be careful when you're interpreting these statistics. But look at the evidence. So.
Thank you.
Corey, have we heard your thoughts on making the streets? How would you make the streets safer?
I think I've already answered.
Oh well, there we are.
I can answer again.
I'll leave it down to you two.
Don't mind it. Anyway, back to you, Duncan. We're eager for a second question.
In that case, the next question from Kim Machipisa. There's Kim hiding. Oh, hiding around there. There we are, Kim. Couldn't see you behind the speaker. Thank you.
Yeah, so the lack of funding in youth services is actually partly responsible for the epidemic in our communities, but how are you actually going to ensure that it doesn't become worse?
Vicky Slade, let's start with you. Youth services and funding, it's been a topical issue for some time. There's been a lack of it. How would you, the Liberal Democrats, ensure that it doesn't become any worse?
So our manifesto does actually include £500 million specifically for youth funding. As I've already mentioned, I run a youth club. We still have youth clubs in Poole. We stopped having youth clubs in Bournemouth. Actually, there is a correlation between actually being able to get access to young people early and spot those things. And I think if we can make sure that there are services in schools and outside of schools for young people to have somebody safe that they can talk to, that's really important, to have an adult outside your family that you can actually go to or that can actually spot what's going on in your life. I think county lines is another major problem that we need to get a grip of, and that is the drugs issue linked with the knife crime issue. Bring those two together, and we really need to get a grip of how we can spot the signs of young people who might be involved in problems like county lines, and that is just one of the most horrific things going on in society right now. I think if we focus our energy, as the Police and Crime Commissioner is trying to do, on the areas surrounding county lines, then we have got a chance to crack that.
Thank you, Vicky. Corey, Labour also keen to kind of return the funding to those what has been lost amongst the youth services. Is that the solution? Is it just more money that youth services need to make it better?
I think it's important that it's quality youth service as well. So we've committed to make sure that there will be properly professionally staffed youth services available to all young people. I know that it's quite easy to do that in a city centre, but we need to make sure that we're not leaving people behind in rural communities. So Labour wants to make sure that the same high quality youth service is available across the board to every young person, and make sure that nobody's left behind. I think that's really important, because otherwise we do get people who become excluded and pushed towards the margins just because of the geography of things. And obviously making sure that we provide proper support and proper resourcing for that, and making sure that we provide then really good work opportunities. So I think that's really important too, to make sure that we're investing. So something Labour also wants to do is make sure we're investing in better opportunities for apprenticeships, because that's also something that a lot of young people are affected by, needs for options for where to go after school, and we need to make sure we provide a variety of things that young people can do.
Thank you, Corey. David, as an independent, how would you secure and make sure that funding would be returned to the youth services if you think that is the solution?
Well, I'd support the kind of increments in funding that we're talking about, the Labour Party and the Lib Dems are talking about for youth services. I think there's a need for provision of parks and facilities, skate parks and things like that. And also I'd want to try and make the money go further by supporting voluntary organisations that exist already, like the Scouts and other young people's clubs.
Ben, supporting voluntary organisations, another possible solution if we can't get all the money we want from the money tree to go back into youth services?
Right. So, the magic money tree, look, the point is that we're spending money on knife crime right now. We're just spending it at the end of the cycle where a knife crime has been committed. So there's a pot of money that we can use to spend, and let's spend it in a better way at the beginning of the cycle. So that's the argument I would make if I was in the legislature, to fund youth services, because if the money's already being spent, then let's spend it before the problems have arisen rather than afterwards.
And finally, Simon Bull on the topic.
Well, again, I think it's very important we review the war on drugs and make some steps in that direction. Youth services, of course, needs proper funding. we need to be looking after our young people. So I would fully support properly funding the youth services, bringing them back to Bournemouth, please, Council Leader, and looking after our young people.
Thank you, Simon. And finally, over to Duncan, I think, for a possible fact check and another question.
Yeah, well, I'm going to pick that one up later on the issue of meat and dairy, but I am going to skip us on to the next question and actually change the subject. So I'm just going to step back in through here to education. Obviously, a really important issue to all of the young people who've helped us with the questions and helped us with suggestions for this debate. Roxanne Cooper, where's Roxanne? Up the top, in the middle. Your question, please, Roxanne.
So Labour introduced tuition fees in 1997 when they said they wouldn't, and the Lib Dems, as part of the coalition government, trebled them in 2010 when they said that they wouldn't scrap them. How can young people trust anything that you say today, and do you think that tuition fees should be scrapped now?
So, Vicky, as the Lib Dem representative, how do you expect young people today to be able to trust Lib Dem policies on tuition now?
So I think, you know, it's fairly well known what happened to us in 2010 when we found ourselves as a junior partner, and I think you have to be really realistic when you look at a manifesto and say a manifesto is about what you would do if it was a government that was run entirely by your group. And when you're a junior partner, I mean, Simon and I are working together across 5 political groups to run BCP Council. None of us are going to get everything that we want. You know, Simon would like us to do a whole lot more on the environment. I'd like to do a whole lot more on some of the other things, and we had to compromise. And I think we understand and we recognise that what happened with the Lib Dems was, you know, a really bad thing. We have to move on though, and we have to say, you know, if we weren't there wouldn't have been a cap on tuition fees, there wouldn't have been maintenance grants, there wouldn't have been a significant increase in the amount that you pay before you start paying it back. You know, there were some good things that were done, but it's about where we are now.
Sorry, Vicky, but to answer the question, Lib Dems trebled the tuition fees.
They were trebled under the coalition.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a slight difference in that we didn't personally treble them. They were trebled at that time. The question is, how can we be trusted? And I think that the reality is, we said sorry, and very often it's about taking on the chin what you did wrong and saying, we made a mistake, we shouldn't have done it, the pledge was made in good faith at the time that it was made, they should have taken a different stance. But you know what, if we're going to keep going back to what somebody did 10 years ago and not allow them to move forward, nobody would ever vote Labour because of the illegal Iraq war. Every political party has made mistakes. We have to move forward, look at where we are now and actually say
thank you. So on that note, Corrie for Labour.
So I'm really glad that you asked that. In 1997, just before that election, Tony Blair came in a helicopter to my high school field, and he smiled at everybody and said lots of nice things, and I wasn't old enough to vote that year, so I didn't vote for him, but he seemed like a nice guy and I probably would have voted for him. Because I'd liked some of Labour's stuff previously and I was quite a political young person. But then when it came the opportunity to do so again, I didn't vote for him because of the fact that he had introduced tuition fees when I felt that was wrong, and because of the Iraq war. And I think there are a lot of reasons to not trust politicians. I think one of the reasons why I'm hoping that we all vote for a different set of people this election is because I think we've all lost trust in politicians, and I'm very glad that I'm not a politician. I think that there are many reasons to question us and to question those that have been in Parliament, and I think that is what we have to do. We have to hold people to account. And I have to say that I think if I'd been part of going back on something that was such a significant general election pledge, then I would be seriously considering my place in a political party that had made that as well. I'm not a lifelong Labour Party member. I'm a Labour Party member now because I believe in our manifesto and our policies now, and I want to deliver those policies. I'm very glad to say that we will scrap the tuition fees. I personally owe about £39,000 now of student debt myself, and I know that I'm going to have to pay that off for the rest of my life, but I don't want other people to be crippled with that kind of debt, especially not when we can see that a lot of those young students won't actually ever pay that off in their lifetime, so it's a waste.
Great. Thank you. So So David, one of your decent values is telling the truth. So how do you respond to young people trusting politicians today?
I don't think they can trust politicians. I can't trust politicians. None of us can trust politicians after what we've seen in the last few years. All the major parties came into power backing a commitment to implement the referendum pledge. That just hasn't happened. So that's why the critical issue in this election, to my mind, and for most people, is do we have a democracy in this country or not? We've gone beyond Brexit, yes or no, to democracy, yes or no. And the Liberal Party hasn't apologised yet for its brazen turning of its back on the referendum result.
Thank you. So back to the question. Ben, how do you think, how do you respond and how do you think young people can trust politicians?
On the trust issue, I mean, God, the only way that you can build trust is by delivering on your promises, and it's a slow thing, isn't it? You know, trust is lost very quickly, but rebuilt slowly. So that's how trust is rebuilt. But on tuition fees, you know, it's comes down to money, doesn't it? So the national debt is £1.8 trillion, and you know, we have a deficit of about 30 billion quid a year, which means that we spend more than we take in or generate in terms of wealth. And so if we were to scrap tuition fees, my understanding is that it would be about 9 billion quid per cohort. It's a question of how we allocate those resources. And I think it's actually important that we don't undermine young people's future chances, because they've got a lot of things on their plate, particularly including the cost of housing, cost of living.
Thank you. Okay, so Simon, thank you, Simon. What do you think about tuition fees being scrapped, and how will you plan to rebuild the trust with young people and politicians?
Okay, I'll take the first question first because that's the easiest. The Green Party would scrap tuition fees. They'd make university accessible to everyone. We would also write off the debts of anybody who has tuition fees under the old £9,000 scheme. I think moving forward, looking at the situation we're in, you mentioned the national debt, which is, last figure I heard was 2 trillion, but I'll take your word, 1.8 trillion. What's 2 billion between friends? Yeah, sorry, thank you. Over the 9.5–10 years of the Conservative government, the national debt has gone up by 1.2 trillion.
I think we're going to fact check.
Yes.
Fact check that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's tripled since the global financial crisis of 2007-8.
And what do we have as a nation to show for that? How are our lives better because of that 1.2 trillion extra in debt, or 1 billion, or 1 trillion, whatever the actual total figure is?
What did we say? 1.8 trillion is the checked figure?
He says, about to check it. Yeah, that sounds about correct. I mean, one thing that is interesting to know, is as interesting as conversations about the national debt can be, is that talking about the actual level of national debt can sometimes mask kind of the historical context of, do we have very high debt now? Now, we do have quite high debt now. Debt as a percentage of the entire economy is 83%, which is higher than it's been for most of the post-war period, mainly due to the financial crisis. That said, it's not as high as it's ever been. During the Second World War, national debt increased to well over 250% of GDP, just for some sort of context.
There we are. So moving on from the national debt, thank you for that. A question from Jenny Marispin, staying with education.
Yeah, I'm not a young voter. You might have noticed I'm a bit middle-aged, but I represent young people, and I'm a school leader and also an Ofsted inspector. And education has suffered significant cuts over the last, 10 years. This has had an impact on staffing, workload, stress levels for teachers, and this transcends down into more stress on students. They have less support in class. Colleagues are leaving the industry, and it's very difficult to recruit and retain good teachers. What are you going to do to attract great teachers back into what was a brilliant profession.
Thank you. So, thank you. So I think we'll start with Simon on that. How are you going to attract great teachers in the future?
I think teachers have been undervalued over the last few years. They're a great resource. They're very necessary for the future of our young people, of course. I know you work for them, but I would scrap Ofsted. I don't think it's working properly. I think we need to stop testing our young people all the time, give them a proper curriculum. As I said earlier, we need to have music on the curriculum, we need to have art on the curriculum, we need to have proper sports time to give a wide, well-balanced. We want well-balanced adults, we need to give them a well-balanced education, and we're not doing that at the moment. We need to put more funding into schools, into education, into teachers. We need to value them. We need to rethink the whole of society. It is not working. It is breaking down. The UK current position is appalling, the way society is going at the moment. And I think we need to...
So to answer the question, sorry, how are you going to attract great teachers in the future?
By valuing them, putting more resources into them, getting rid of Ofsted and having a different system where you're not testing young people all the time, giving them the chance to learn a wider education system that meets all needs, not just a sausage factory that pushes out people without giving them proper respect.
Thank you. Vicky, you're nodding your head there.
Yeah, we have very, very similar policies on this. We would replace Ofsted as well. We would scrap SATs at 11. We would actually give teachers a real increase in salary and invest in their training and their development, because that's really important. I think one of the biggest issues that I see with teachers, I'm a school governor, is the behaviour that they're having to deal with children. Is, they didn't come into school to have to manage that levels of behaviour. They didn't come in to be mental health workers. They didn't come in to be social workers. And part of that is around the fact that the children are being taught such a limited curriculum. They're being stifled, and so kids are not happy. And actually, if you've got happy kids, they're going to behave better. So I think we believe in a much broader curriculum for life, so that kids actually learn about things that they need for adulthood, bring in vocational courses back so that we can make sure that children of all abilities benefit. And I think the knock-on effect to teachers is that teachers actually are in an environment where kids want to be, and rather than being either hothoused or corralled somewhere where they just are not experiencing anything positive.
Thank you. So, Ben, how do you respond to the question, but also to Vicky's comments about wanting to increase teachers' salary and also the scrapping of Ofsted?
Well, I mean, in terms of this is a recruitment problem, and recruitment can be solved in a number of different ways. You can advertise an industry to look for new sources of teachers. You can. I think what Vicky said about the role sliding into other areas was an important one. I've spoken to teachers before, and they've said that they've told me that increasingly they're being asked to do more and more outside of the kind of core remit of educating students. But you know what? I think something that could go a long way, which wouldn't cost a lot of money, is giving teachers the ability, more agency over what they do, rather than kind of making the job more fulfilling for them, and speaking to them, finding out what makes them tick, and helping them kind of pursue that. So effectively making the job more attractive to people, so that people are more inclined to become teachers. And obviously, the wider societal thing about whether we respect teachers, I don't think the government can actually do anything about that. But that's something for us to kind of think about on ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you. And Corrie, how do you respond to the question, how are Labour going to attract great teachers and retain them?
Yes, so I think it's amazing that anybody's still teaching, because we hear about so many difficulties with our teaching staff, and the obstacles that you face, from having to buy equipment and providing extra care and doing a lot of extra hours. In order to try and release some of the pressure on teaching staff, we want to remove the public sector pay cap, make sure that the pay is fair. We want to make more non-contact time actually allocated into the teachers' schedules, so that rather than having to plan all of their lessons at home, that they've actually got time to do that, because we know a lot of teachers are doing a lot of extra hours.
properly fund our schools for the equipment and also the structures of the schools that are starting to fall apart in some cases, to make sure that, again, teaching staff aren't having to deal with those problems as well as the teaching of the lessons. Similarly to what the Lib Dems and the Greens said, we would scrap the SATs. We would replace Ofsted with a new body that was more accountable to local government, and we would also look at we'll bring the academised schools back into accountability to local government.
Thank you.
And to the teachers and the governors.
Thank you very much. And David, how do you thank you. How do you respond to across the panel really the discussion of scrapping Ofsted, but also to Corey's comment about removing the public sector pay cap, and how would you retain teachers?
Yeah, I think retention is the key issue from my understanding of it. I certainly want to look at the evidence for this. I want to understand why teachers are leaving, but just anecdotally, from many people I know in the profession have left for a variety of reasons. One is because they spend a lot of their time trying to be heard in the classroom. So there are problems with discipline in schools that are just very wearing if you're trying to teach. That needs tackling, and that's a broad discussion as to how to do that. They need help there. But they're also overworked and underpaid with all the marking and everything that goes on. So there are definitely pay issues there. And Ofsted does seem to come in for unremitting criticism. So, you know, this is not an area on which I have a fully formed policy. I'm an independent. I came in really motivated by the Brexit issue above all, and it is surprising to me that we have not discussed that at all.
Well, on that note,
exactly.
Let's pass to Duncan.
You were waiting to give me the cue and the prompt. So now, our next question is on that very subject. Matt Simpson, where's Matt hiding? There we are. Matt, ask your question to the panel, please.
Can you reassure me that it won't be affected if we leave?
So, I think clarify the question there. As a young person, a no-deal Brexit may shatter his hopes of a job abroad. How can you ensure that a no-deal Brexit doesn't jeopardise the career of this young man as he leaves university? David Young.
Well, I remember before we went into the EU, you know, people went abroad and worked, and there were visas, and it wasn't at all difficult. And of course, people go and work all around the world, not just in the EU. But I mean, it was easy to go and get a job in France, and lots of people went and did that, or Germany, or whatever. So I don't see why it should be particularly difficult. It may obviously require a visa or something going forward, but I think we'll have pretty close reciprocal arrangements with the EU going forward, because
a no deal may jeopardise that. There may not be such arrangements if there is a no deal.
I don't think so. I mean, I think, you know, in a no deal situation, or what I'd call a WTO deal situation, we would then be able to negotiate from a position of strength, because we are huge net importers, and the EU needs us economically more than we actually need them. The EU only accounts for about 20%, if that, of our GDP. If we got out cleanly, then we could have a proper negotiation rather than the nonsense that's been going on for 3 years, which is putting us on the verge of having to pay 39 billion plus for nothing.
David, thank you very much. Vicky Slade, a no-deal Brexit may jeopardise this gentleman's job and career in the future. Is that something that the Lib Dems want to choose?
I completely agree with you. No-deal Brexit will be a complete disaster for this country, and it's not off the table. Well, because you can't negotiate a deal in months. It will take years, and whilst that deal is being negotiated, WTO rules means that we will have tariffs on virtually everything. Imagine you're wanting to buy yourself a car, and you know there's going to be a deal in 2 years' time. You're going to buy a car now, or you're going to wait for that deal? So what's going to happen in those 2 years? What's going to happen in the period of time that you're negotiating that deal? You're not going to go and buy your German car with those. You're going to wait, and during that time, those people aren't going to be paid. So, because you've got to pay people whilst cars aren't being sold. So, no deal is something we have to know is off the table. And the concern that we have with this deal that Boris Johnson has supposedly negotiated, what we haven't seen because he should have put it in his manifesto, and it's a real shame there's no one from the Conservative Party here to defend it today.
Here. I agree with you on that.
the point is that he has absolutely ruled out extending the transition period beyond the end of next year, which means that if that deal is not negotiated by the middle of the summer, we will fall out with no deal, and all of our rights and all of our arrangements will be, you know, in a really precarious situation whilst a new deal is done. It took 7 years for the Canada deal to be negotiated. We're not just kissing goodbye to the EU, we're kissing goodbye to deals with 52 countries around the world.
I'm keen to give David his response.
Well, with on the question of, you know, the effect of tariffs and so on, if we came out of the EU, we'd be outside the protectionist fortress. We wouldn't have to be imposing the EU tariffs.
We'd be in the WTO, which gives us automatic tariffs under the WTO rules.
Yeah.
WTO comes with tariffs.
Okay, can I reply to you?
I'm hoping they're going to fact check that.
Yeah, no, what I'm saying is outside the protectionist fortress, fact checkers, we wouldn't have to be paying all sorts of tariffs that the EU levies on third world farmers who are trying to provide their crops. So there's a basic issue of equity or inequity. But leaving that aside, we would have access to cheaper food and cheaper footwear that would come from outside the EU, on which we currently have to pay EU tariffs.
So if we have this cheaper stuff coming from abroad, how are our British farmers going to compete other than reducing their prices, which they won't be able to do unless they reduce standards here?
British farmers don't produce bananas.
I'm just going to bring in, you asked for fact checkers, so we're just going to bring in the fact checkers to talk about tariffs.
Sure. So just a kind of slight challenge to the point about what WTO means. For people who don't follow the debate, basically if you have no preferential trade agreement with another country, you'll trade under what's called WTO terms. And essentially that means you can't offer a better deal to one country than another unless you've got a proper deal in place. It's kind of a bit counterintuitive, but so it is. Now, if you are trading under WTO terms, it doesn't mean that there are tariffs on everything. For example, I think just heard the point at the end, the UK does not grow any bananas. It would be absurd to have a tariff on bananas to protect the UK's domestic banana producers, because there are none. So, and the UK actually, when there was no deal planning, there was a kind of preliminary schedule of tariffs laid out for if we left the EU without a deal, what kind of tariffs we would set, and it was to reduce tariffs on a lot of goods, so there wouldn't be as much of a big increase in tariffs as we might expect. However, there are a vast variety of what are called non-tariff barriers, which are arguably even more important than tariff barriers. So, for example, if you're trading services, there's a lot to do with kind of regulatory alignment and things like that. So it's not completely accurate to say that under WTO terms there'll be tariffs on everything, but also focusing on tariffs is maybe not the entirety of the issue about leaving with a WTO deal.
Thank you, fact checkers. I'm keen to move this on to Ben Ashton. Ben, you say you're an independent, clean Brexit candidate. What on earth is a clean Brexit, and how on earth can we get it now?
Well, it's two huge questions. I mean, a clean Brexit is basically extricating ourselves from the legislative oversight of the EU completely, so that we're free to legislate how we'd like, according to the democratic will of people of Britain. So if we want to install tariffs on something, then we can. But if we don't want those tariffs, then we don't have to install those tariffs, because, of course, tariffs are unilaterally controlled by us. We set the tariffs. In fact, a tariff is a tax set by us on us. So they're rather silly things. And in fact, the average tariff is quite small. In fact, it's well within the margin, within the average currency fluctuation. So tariffs, like the fact checker said, are a bit of a red herring, really.
Can you reassure that this gentleman's dreams of travelling abroad after university won't be shattered by Brexit?
I don't know what his dreams are, but I mean, you know, if he wants to go and live, work abroad, then of course, most countries have a mechanism for young people to go and work there. And so, if you look at the stats, most people, most Britons who are working abroad, don't work within the European Union, as far as I understand. I'll ask the fact checker on that. But suffice to say that, you know, destinations like Australia are very popular with young people, and we have no arrangement with them.
We want to get everyone's voice heard. Yeah. Corey, Drew, everyone on the panel here has a position on Brexit. They've openly talked about their position and what they want. Jeremy Corbyn has remained controversially neutral. Do you have a position on Brexit?
Can I answer that question
Yes.
as well? Brilliant. So I think precisely because of your concerns about how you would personally be affected by a no-deal Brexit, that is why Labour has always stood against a no-deal Brexit. And I think the idea of an unknown deal is also equally as troubling. Labour in government would make sure that if we do leave the European Union, as is currently what we have voted to do, that would be with a deal which would protect our relationship to trade and to live and work with Europe, and to make sure that we are rescued from some of the worst repercussions of the bad deal that Boris Johnson's put on the table, and a no deal. So Labour is keen to make sure that the deal that we would put on the table would be one which would keep that relationship and keep that door open. But the reason that we will put that back for a public vote is that currently we've had 3.5 years now of the Conservatives' way of doing things, and they haven't worked cross-party, and we're all quite divided on the issue.
Would that public vote include the option to remain in the European Union?
Well, yes, so that would be the two options, would be the option of a deal, which Labour will lay out beforehand. So unlike in the previous referendum, you would actually know exactly what you were voting on beforehand. We will lay the deal out and put that against the option to remain, so it will be transparent. As well as being transparent, because we know that people don't want to spend the rest of their lives talking about Brexit, I know I don't, we need to make it legally binding so that we know that whatever the outcome of that deal, it will be acted on, and that will draw a line under it.
Simon Bull, a second referendum, a solution, and could this gentleman's dreams of a job abroad be shattered with a no-deal Brexit?
The Green Party are in favour of a people's vote, which I think is the right way forward. A vote where there'll be 3 issues to vote on, which we...
Didn't we have one?
We had one 3.5 years ago, which was very controversial.
Should we have another
before
one in
we knew?
3.5 years?
Well, if you let me finish, I'll say the Green position.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Go.
So with 3 options...
We're going to let Simon speak first, David, then we'll come back to you. Thanks.
Okay.
3 options on it will be the deal, no deal, or remain. And that will be the decision taken. The people will have a better understanding of what they're letting themselves in for. In 2016, there was lots of misinformation, shall we say. There was blatant lying. There was funding issues around the Leave campaign and how they funded their campaign, which were very questionable. We're still waiting for the report on the Russian issue, which should come out shortly. There was Cambridge Analytics. So there are many reasons why that first vote is very controversial, and whether it is a valid vote. Mm-hmm. There is also
let me put that to David Young. Misinformation, admittedly rife around the first referendum. Simon arguing here that rules out the result of the first. Surely there should be a second.
I think there was deception on both sides, but I mean, if you go back to the founding of the EU, there was deception. One of the founders, Monnet, said the whole thing had to be constructed in stealth because you wouldn't get people accepting basically the construction of a super state if they had a chance to vote on it. And you know, the Conservatives right from the beginning have used deceit to foist the EU on us. We thought we were joining a common market. Actually, there's always been this plan to have common governance.
Conservatives aren't here to refrain from that comment, so I'd like you to focus on the issue in hand at the moment.
So I deplore deceit on any side. You know, so we'd have to be very careful if we did have another referendum. You know, to try and rule it out. But how could we be sure that we did? And then there's the issue of how many people were really affected by whatever was on the side of a bus, as opposed to other things. I mean, discontent with the EU has been brewing for 40 years, and it's shared widely across the EU. We're not the only country that has problems with the EU.
Well, David, thank you. I'm just going to jump in there because we've got one more question that I'd like to ask very quickly before the end. But there's just a quick check about the...
Sure. I mean, it was just mentioned there in passing, and it's not by any means the most important thing that's been mentioned tonight. But the claim that one of the EU's founders, Jean Monnet, basically said that the EU had to be developed in stealth. Now, I'm not sure about the exact quote that was being referenced, but there is a sort of urban myth that goes around quite a lot on sort of more sort of pro-leave Facebook groups and stuff. A quote saying of Jean Monnet saying, "Europe's nations should be guided towards the superstate without their people understanding what is happening. This can be accomplished by successive steps, each disguised as having an economic purpose, but which will eventually lead to federation." This is actually not a quote from Jean Monnet. It's a kind of an author who wrote in 1997 summarising what they thought Monnet was trying to say. So I'm not saying that that wasn't his intention or what he was doing, but it is a bit of a trope. This kind of quote with a picture of Monnet goes around quite a lot on social media, so I just wanted to be clear about that.
Thank you. On the topic of misinformation, I believe, Duncan, you have a second question?
Yeah, Rachel Pyrrhus in the audience, very briefly. Quickly ask your question for us.
So young people feel they were misinformed by politicians when they cast the Brexit vote. So would you agree your generation has let down our generation?
So briefly down the panel, because we haven't got a lot of time. So the question was again, do you believe you've let down our generation? Your generation has let down our generation.
Simon Bull, let's start with you and let's keep it brief, nice and quick.
Yes.
Vicky Slade. Vicky Slade, has the older generation let down the youth?
Definitely, we should have had 16 and 17-year-olds voting, and I'm pretty sure we would have been in a different position.
David Young.
Yes, and Parliament's let us all down, and the growth of the debt is a terrible indictment of what our generation is doing to future generations.
Ben Aston.
I mean, I don't know, my generation, has it let your generation down? I mean, I think the older generations have something to answer for with respect to some areas of political theory, like, for example, the housing crisis, which I think is very important to young people. But on Brexit, no, I don't think you've been let down on that. And I think, you know, if people have got, if it's shown legally through the court of law that the Brexit referendum was held improperly.
We're going to have to keep this as brief as we can.
Then I'll finish on this. Then by all means, if that referendum is shown to be legally invalid, then have another referendum. But so far, that has not been shown to be the case.
And Corey.
I don't like to pitch different age groups against each other. So although I kind of agree with what you're saying, I think it's more from where I've been sitting as a local resident that kind of straddles the two generations, that it's the political class that have actually let down the rest of us in terms of honesty. So I would I'd frame it more that way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. I believe that's all we have time for. Duncan, some final words.
Yeah, just I think first of all, just a thank you to our fact checkers. Anything, Abbas, you want to say that was picked up along the way that we've not mentioned?
Yeah, sure. There was one point mentioned quite a while ago that we didn't get time to talk about, which was what an individual can do to impact the climate most beneficially, I suppose. So I'm just going to get the point, but I think that Corey, you made the point that the meat and dairy industry is the worst thing for kind of the environment, I believe you said. Now that, so there was a paper published saying by far the where you can have the least impact in terms of carbon emissions, at least, or greenhouse gas emissions, is not having a child. And actually kind of having a meat-free diet is not as perhaps beneficial with respect to CO2, because there are a lot of environmental issues that it would impact, as for example taking one fewer transatlantic flight a year would save twice as much greenhouse gas emissions as going completely meat-free. So just a bit of context there.
Abbas, thank you very much. Well, I shall just leave it at this point to say thank you to you, the audience. Thank you to the audience members and people who've submitted questions to our panel this evening. Thank you to our fact checkers. Thank you to our hosts, Connor and Nicole, this evening. Thank you, of course, to our panel, who will all be hoping for your vote on Thursday evening. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Very well done. Thank you.